I rushed the altar of St. Joseph's Catholic Cathedral in Nairobi, Kenya, with 8 men during communion, with the sole intention of grabbing the consecrated host from the priest's hands and holding it up for the congregation to see, to prove in front of everyone that what they called the body of God was nothing more than a wafer of baked flour. But the moment my hand reached that altar, something happened that left 800 people completely speechless, including the 8 men who had come in with me, and every single one of the Christians who had been kneeling in those pews. Have you ever been so certain you were on the right side of God, that the moment He showed you otherwise was the last thing in the world you saw coming? My name is Salim Farouk Al-Amin. I am 29 years old, and on the morning of September 8, 2018, I led 8 men down the center aisle of St. Joseph's Catholic Cathedral on Wabera Street in Nairobi, Kenya, during the distribution of Holy Communion, with one intention: to take the Eucharist from the priest before it could be consumed and expose it publicly as an ordinary thing with no power and no presence. I had no idea that the morning I had planned as a humiliation for Christianity would become the morning that dismantled every certainty I had spent my entire life building. I grew up in the Eastleigh neighborhood of Nairobi, in a Somali Muslim community so cohesive you could live inside it for years without needing anything from outside it. My father, Sheikh Farouk Ibrahim Al-Amin, led Friday prayers at the Al-Noor Mosque on First Avenue, and was respected the way men are respected when their knowledge and their conduct are both beyond question. He had studied in Saudi Arabia in his 20s, and returned with a theological precision that shaped everything in our household. My mother Hodan ran weekly Quran circles for the women of our street, with the consistency of someone who had never considered doing anything else. Faith was the first language of our home, the way we understood time, obligation, identity, and each other. I memorized the Quran by 14, the youngest in my father's circle to complete it. He called me before the congregation one Friday and prayed over me at the front of the mosque, and the pride I felt was so complete it left no room for anything else. While other boys in Eastleigh ran street football or gathered at tea shops after school, I was working through commentary texts and attending study circles 3 evenings a week. I fasted every Ramadan from the age of 9, added voluntary fasts regularly, and never once seriously questioned whether what I believed was true. It was the water I swam in. It was the ground I stood on. My father taught me about Christianity with the calm authority that settles into a person and becomes the shape of their thinking. Christians had distorted the original revelation of Isa. The Trinity was a construction, not a disclosure, and the Eucharist, the central act of Catholic worship, was the fullest expression of shirk, the elevation of a human being to divine status, performed ritually in buildings all over the world. By 21, I was involved in a Muslim advocacy organization in Nairobi, challenging Christian influence in Eastleigh and surrounding areas. We distributed materials outside churches, organized resistance to church construction permits, and publicly challenged missionary activity near our schools and mosques. I was committed and effective, and both felt like forms of worship. By 28, I was a logistics coordinator at an import company in the industrial area, earning a consistent salary and known at the mosque as a young man who combined religious seriousness with practical capability. I was engaged to a woman named Fadumo, the daughter of a respected elder in the community, a woman who prayed her 5 prayers without reminder and spoke about her faith with a quiet certainty I found stabilizing. We were to be married the following spring. I had work, a future, a family whose pride in me was never in question, and a community that gave me identity and purpose. I want you to understand before anything else, I was not a man in crisis. I was not searching. I was not unhappy. I had everything, and I knew it, and I was grateful for all of it. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever stood so completely inside a life you had built that the idea of it not being the whole truth never once produced any anxiety in you at all? The trigger came in August of 2018. A senior member of our organization, a man everyone called Brother Yusuf, brought a printed flyer to one of our meetings. St. Joseph's Cathedral was holding a special high mass to mark the birthday of the Virgin Mary, with a visiting bishop from Rome presiding. The flyer described the Eucharist as the real presence of Jesus Christ, the living body of God offered to his people. Brother Yusuf set the flyer down and said a building in the center of Nairobi was publicly inviting the entire city to consume what it claimed was God himself, with no challenge from anyone in our community. The plan formed over 2 meetings. We would attend the Mass, go to the front during communion, and I would take the host and hold it up, state in Swahili and English that this was wheat and water and nothing more. I had no idea that the plan I volunteered to lead was the specific road that Jesus was going to use to walk directly into my life. I recruited 7 men over 3 weeks. Bashir, a law student at the University of Nairobi, composed under pressure in the way few men twice his age managed to be. Mahad, whose family had run a business beside a church compound in Westlands for years and nursed long-standing grievances from it. Jama, my closest friend since we were 11, who had not once questioned whether following me was the right decision. We visited St. Joseph's Cathedral twice as ordinary visitors, mapped the nave, the approach to the altar, the ushers' positions. We would enter from the main doors, move down the center aisle during communion distribution, and reach the priest before anyone could intervene. Have you ever been so convinced you were defending truth that you never once stopped to ask whether the God you were defending it for had anything to do with the plan? The night before, I prayed tahajjud alone at 2 in the morning, asking Allah for steadiness and clarity. When I sat back on my heels, something arrived that I noticed without understanding. A stillness in the room thicker than ordinary quiet, a weight in the center of my chest that was not anxiety and not illness, but was steady and attentive in the way a presence is attentive. I named it as Shaitan, creating doubt in a man preparing for righteous work. I dismissed it, lay down, and barely slept until Fajr. We arrived at St. Joseph's Cathedral on Wabira Street at 9:30 on a Sunday morning in September. The street outside was already full of people moving toward the entrance, families in their best clothes, elderly women walking carefully up the steps, young children being held by the hand. The cathedral facade was stone, wide and tall, with a wooden cross above the entrance and the doors standing open onto a cool interior. We joined the crowd moving up the steps and entered without anyone looking at us twice. Inside, the smell reached me before anything else, incense and old wood, and something beneath both of them that I could not place, a heaviness in the air that was not unpleasant and was unlike any other interior I had walked into. The cathedral was already full, long wooden pews running the length of a high vaulted nave, morning light coming through the stained glass windows on the eastern side, and laying down columns of amber and blue across the stone floor. Candles burned along the walls and at the altar, which was elevated at the end of the nave on 3 shallow steps, dressed in white and gold for the feast. The congregation was singing, a gathered, low sound that filled the space from the ceiling down and had a weight to it I did not want to examine. An elderly woman in the second pew caught my eye as I moved past her and smiled at me with a completeness that had no conditions attached to it. I kept moving. The bishop elevated the host at 10:25. That was the signal. I stood. My men stood with me, 8 of us rising from the pews near the front and moving into the center aisle, walking fast toward the altar. The congregation registered us in a wave, heads turning, a low sound of alarm moving through the pews, one man half rising from his seat before the person beside him placed a hand on his arm. The usher on the right side of the aisle stepped forward and then stopped. He did not move to intercept us. He bowed his head and began to pray where he stood. The priest at the altar, an older Kenyan man in white and gold vestments, turned to face us as we came. He did not lower the host. He held it elevated in both hands and looked directly at me, and his expression was the thing I was least prepared for. Not fear, not anger, not confusion, but something that looked like recognition, like a man watching something arrive that he had been told to expect. A woman in the front pew turned to face me as I came level with her and said in Swahili, very quietly, so quietly it should not have reached me over the noise of 800 people, "Jesus loves you, brother. He knows why you came." I was past her before the sentence finished. I reached the altar step. I raised my hand toward the host. That is when it happened. The moment that changed everything I believed about God. The light came first, not from the candles and not from the windows, from the host itself, a white gold light at its center that was interior and sourceless and absolutely steady, the kind of light that does not flicker because it does not depend on anything that could be disturbed. I had 1 second of seeing it clearly before the heat arrived in my raised hand, moving inward through my palm, up through my wrist and forearm and into my chest, expanding there with a thoroughness that left no room for anything that had been there before. Not my arguments, not my certainty, not the speech I had prepared, not the face of Brother Yusuf, Not a single one of the 1,000 reasons I had brought with me to that altar. All of it cleared in the space of a breath, replaced by something enormous and patient and entirely certain of itself. My arm stopped moving. The signal from my mind arrived and found nothing waiting to receive it. I stood at the foot of the altar, with my hands 6 inches from the host, and I could not advance, and I could not retreat. And in that stillness, the knowing came. Not a voice, not words assembled in order, something that moved through the heat in my chest and arrived complete, the way a truth arrives when you have been in the presence of evidence long enough, not argued into you, but simply, suddenly, undeniably there. I know you. Every morning, every prayer, every fast you kept in the dark when no one was watching. I was there, Salim. I have always been there, and you have finally come to the right place. My knees went. I did not choose it. The marble step was under me, and I was weeping before I understood that I was weeping. Tears on the stone floor, my whole chest opening with something that had no name in any language I had ever been given. Something that felt like relief so enormous it had become indistinguishable from grief. I could not have stopped it if my life had depended on stopping it. Behind me I heard Bashir hit the floor, then Mahad, then Jama, my oldest friend, who made a sound I had never heard from him in 18 years of friendship. One by one my 8 men went to the floor of St. Joseph's Cathedral, and the sound of it, that soft percussion of knees finding stone, was the most significant sound I have ever heard in my life. 2 men near the back stood frozen, and then turned and left through the main doors. I understand that. I would have run too if my legs had been available to me. The congregation was completely silent. Then one voice began to pray, a woman somewhere in the middle of the pews, and then another joined, and within a minute the whole cathedral was praying together. 800 people in a low, continuous, unhurried sound that had no triumph in it and no shock in it. Only the sound of people who had been holding something in hope for a long time and were watching it come true. The bishop came down from the altar. He was an older man with gray at his temples, and the bearing of someone who had spent enough years in the presence of prayer that urgency had been replaced by something quieter and more reliable. He knelt on the floor beside me. He placed both hands on my shoulders and waited until I could hear him. Then he said in English, low and direct, "He loves you, son. He has been waiting for you." Ask yourself this question. How do you explain the moment the God you came to disprove introduces himself to you by name and tells you he has been waiting? I had no idea, standing on that marble floor, that the question I had entered with, "What is this bread, really?" was about to be answered in a way I could never have prepared for. When I could finally stand, I asked the bishop what I was supposed to do now. It was the only question that made sense. He helped me to my feet and led 4 of us to the front of the nave. Bashir was beside me. Jama was beside me. One other man who I will not name here because his family does not yet know his story. The bishop prayed with us, and in that prayer, I said the truest words I have ever spoken. Jesus, I came here today to prove you did not exist in that bread. I have been wrong about you for my entire life. I do not fully understand what just happened, but I know that it was you, and I know that you are real. Forgive me. I surrender everything I thought I was. Take me completely. 5 of my men gave their lives to Jesus Christ that morning, on the floor of St. Joseph's Cathedral in Nairobi. I was baptized 7 weeks later and given the name Thomas, because, the bishop said, Thomas also needed to see before he could believe, and became unshakable the moment he did. I have never been given a name that described me more accurately. I had no idea what that name was going to ask me to lay down. My father took my call in silence, and then his voice arrived, cold in a way I had only heard once before in my life, when my uncle had brought shame on the family years ago, and my father had spoken his name for the last time. He said, "You are no longer my son. You are dead to us, and to the name of Al-Amin. Do not call this number again." My mother did not call. She sent my younger brother to my flat with a single box, and he stood in the doorway and handed it to me without entering, and would not meet my eyes. Fadumo's father contacted me through a third party to end the engagement formally. Fadumo herself sent one message, 3 words in Somali meaning, "I grieve for you," and then nothing more. The organization I had given 8 years to declared me apostate in a message circulated to every member. My employer, whose business ran through connections in the Eastleigh community, let me go within 6 weeks. I received communications that made staying in Nairobi unsafe, and I left the city 5 months after my baptism. My father, my mother, my fiancé, my community, my work, my city. All of it surrendered inside 1 year. But I gained everything that truly matters. I gained Jesus Christ, which means forgiveness I had no claim to, peace that had no conditions and no ceiling, and a love so consistent it rewrote the definition of the word for me entirely. I gained a church family in the city where I resettled, who treated me as their own in the daily, practical, unspectacular ways that genuine love shows itself. I met a woman named Esther 16 months after my baptism, at a Pentecostal fellowship in Mombasa, where I had resettled. She was the daughter of a Kenyan pastor, a woman who laughed freely and prayed with the directness of someone who had never doubted she was being heard. We were married at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Nairobi. I returned for that specifically because it was the only right place to do it. The bishop who had knelt beside me on the marble floor officiated. 3 of the men who had gone down at that altar with me stood beside me as groomsmen. Esther and I have a son. His name is Emmanuel. The first sound he heard in the world was not the Adhan. It was his mother singing over him in the delivery room. I now carry the testimony of Jesus Christ to Somali and East African Muslim communities across Kenya and in diaspora communities in the United Kingdom. I had no idea, on the morning I walked into St. Joseph's Cathedral to expose the Eucharist as ordinary, that more than 80 Muslims would eventually come to faith in Christ through hearing what happened at that altar. I still write to my parents at Eid and at Christmas. I have received no reply. I pray for them with the same constancy they gave me, and I trust the God who found me on a marble floor to find them wherever they are. I returned to that altar once, standing in the exact place where my knees had given way. I placed my hand on the step and stayed for a long time. The man who rushed that altar with certainty and a prepared speech no longer exists. In his place stands a follower of Jesus Christ who would give up every earthly thing again before denying the name of the one who met him there. If Jesus can love someone like me, a man who walked to his altar with contempt fully loaded and ready, then no version of your story puts you beyond his reach. The same Jesus who stopped my hand and broke me open on the floor of St. Joseph's Cathedral is present in this moment, through this testimony, reaching toward whatever in you has been held closed the longest. He is not waiting for you to have fewer questions. He is not waiting for a cleaner version of you to arrive. Look inside your own heart right now. Jesus is calling you right now, not at the end of this, not when the timing is better, but in this exact breath. Will you let him in and find out what I found on that floor?